Now, in terms of Williams's analysis, Hannah Arendt was as interested in the formula, or she was interested in the formula, but she was equally interested in the mass itself. As she tells him, it's all around me. You know, she's not giving ground in that letter. The mass was not just the product of inhumane ways of seeing, belonging to the realm of ideology, if you like, but it was also the product of inhumane ways of governing and existed materially on the ground. The ultimate aim of totalitarianism, noted Arendt, was to make human beings superfluous. What totalitarian ideologies therefore aim at, she says, is not the transformation of the outside world or the revolutionizing transmutation of society, but the transformation of human nature itself. Quotation 9. Radical evil has emerged in connection with a system in which all men have become equally superfluous. The manipulators of the system believe in their own superfluousness as much as in that of all others. And the totalitarian murderers are all the more dangerous because they do not care if they themselves are alive or dead, if they ever lived or were never born. The danger of the corpse factories and holes of oblivion is that today, with populations and homelessness everywhere on the increase, masses of people are continuously rendered superfluous if we continue to think of the world in utilitarian terms. Political, social, and economic events everywhere are in silent conspiracy with totalitarian instruments devised for making men superfluous. The superfluous man, for Arendt, loses his political status. This is the point where the inborn and inalienable rights of man, the universal rights of man shorn of any other shells, comes into play. But it seemed that a man who is nothing but his humanness loses the very quality that makes it possible for him to be treated as a human being by others. Indeed, the idea of the human being as such, says Arendt, of the human reduced to her essence, had been realized most frighteningly in the concentration camps. In her remarkable chapter in Origins of Totalitarianism called The Decline of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man, Arendt made a distinction between universal, pre-political human rights, possessed by every human being as such, and the specific political rights that one could acquire from being a political citizen of a particular nation. Arendt had witnessed at first hand the way in which, the key quotes are collected under number 10 on the handout, the way in which the assumed existence of a human being as such broke down at the very moment when those who professed to believe in it were for the first time confronted with people who had indeed lost all other qualities and specific relationships, except that they were still human. That is, she's thinking of herself, having been denied her citizenship, her German citizenship, as a Jew. Arendt had found herself denied of human rights in 1940, at the very moment when she was reduced to being human in general, and thus in most need of the protection of those universal human rights, which belong to individuals independent of citizenship. But deprived of the particular social political identity that accounted for citizenship, the Jews of 1940s Europe found that they were no longer recognized as human at all. The world, noted Arendt in a chilling sentence, found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. The loss of citizenship was the loss of the right to have rights, resulting in a political death. Those in this condition may become objects of charity or benevolence, she says, but they have no first-order claims as citizens. They become non-citizens with respect to justice. So the conclusion that Arendt comes to is that universal human rights can only find expression within particular forms of national citizenship. There is no usable concept of human nature that can be accessed independently from particular communities. The concept of human rights, she states, can again be meaningful only if they're redefined to mean a right to the human condition itself, which depends upon belonging to some human community. And again, man, it turns out, can lose all so-called rights of man without losing his essential quality as man, his human dignity. Only the loss of a polity itself expels him from humanity. Rhan's focus is on polity, on the state, this idea of looking at things from above. Polity, the state, citizenship, the structures that secure from above, that individuals have, in Arendt's powerful phrase and famous phrase, the right to have rights. For Raymond Williams, on the other hand, it was, quotation 11, a serious misunderstanding to suppose that the problems of social identity are resolved by formal, merely legal definitions. For unevenly, and at times precariously, but always through long experience substantially, an effective awareness of social identity depends on actual and sustained social relationships. To reduce social identity to formal legal definitions at the level of the state is to collude in the alienated superficialities of the nation, which are the limited functional terms of the modern ruling class. Throughout the chapter on the culture of nations in his volume of 1983 called Towards 2000, the artificial, what he calls the artificial political structure of the nation-state, is contrasted with alternative forms of identity. Alternative forms of identity variously designated as deeply grounded, settled, real, residual. The tendency to espouse the legal forms of national citizenship is seen to derive from a mobile and detached intellectual class, says Williams. Francis Mulhern found Williams's distinction between natural communities and the artificial order of the nation-state to be disturbing. And it was this dimension of Towards 2000 that led the black British critic Paul Gilroy to argue that Williams's conception of national belonging was essentialist and hard, ultimately, to differentiate from the overt racism of an Enoch Powell. The African-American critic Henry Louis Gates has noted that about 25 years or so after the publication of Culture and Society, quotation 12, people began to scrutinize Williams's reliance on the notion of a common culture, on the historical rootedness of the English working man, on the valorization of lived identities formed through long experience and actual sustained social relations. Writing in 1983, for example, Williams advanced a seemingly organicist conception of culture based on ethno-territorial continuity. And then he quotes Williams, "The real history of the peoples of these islands goes back to the remarkable society of the Neolithic shepherds and farmers, and back beyond them to the hunting peoples who did not simply disappear, but are also among our ancestors." But if this is the real history, says Gates, it follows that some of us, those not numbered among the possessive collectivity, our ancestors, must not be Britain's real people. The passage reprises the Anglo-Saxonist myths of lineage that serve to buttress an exclusionary and imperialist ideology of Englishness. Remember, this is a country where, in the 1950s, Winston Churchill could suggest to Harold Macmillan that if the Conservative Party wanted to win elections, it should adopt the slogan, "Keep England White." Now, in its own terms, there's little to disagree with here. Williams himself began to question his early commitment to a common culture. And it would seem that phrases such as real history do indeed seem to suggest an ethno-territorial conception of identity. But as a statement on Williams's position, the analysis is actually profoundly misleading. Quotation 13 on the handout is the passage from Raymond Williams's Towards 2000, from which Gates has selected his quotations. And it's worth reading it at length, because you can see how selective this picture of Williams is and how it's developed. What is most intolerable, says Williams, and unreal in existing projections of England or Britain is the historical and cultural ignorance. The UK, of course, is neither historical nor cultural. It's a jargon term of commercial and military planning. I remember a leader of the Labour Party opposing British entry to the European community, asserting that it would be the end of 1,000 years of history. Why 1,000, I wondered? The only meaningful date by that reckoning would be somewhere around 1066, when a Norman French replaced a Norse-Saxon monarchy. What then of the English? That would be some 1,500 years. The British, some 2,500. But the real history of the peoples of these islands goes back very much further than that. At least 6,000 years to the remarkable societies of the Neolithic shepherds and farmers, and back beyond them to the hunting peoples who did not simply disappear, but are also among our ancestors. Thus, the leader of a nationally popular party could not in practice think about the realities of his own people. He could not think about their history, except in the alienated forms of a centralized nation-state. And that he deployed these petty projections as a self-evident argument against attempts at wider European identity would be incomprehensible in all its actual and approved former European reorganization if the cultural and historical realities had not been so systematically repressed by a functional and domineering selective patriotism. All the varied peoples who have lived on this island are in a substantial physical sense still here. What is from time to time projected as an island race is in reality a long process of successive conquests and repressions, but also of successive supersessions and relative integrations. So I think, without glossing it, it's fairly clear that the passage in no way reprises the Anglo-Saxon myths of lineage that Gates accuses Williams of doing. To the contrary, the whole point of the argument regarding the real and plural history of the British Isles, the endless sequence of conquests, repressions, integrations, is to undermine and to deconstruct and to reject the myths on which the contemporary evocations of Englishness and Britishness are based. And what gives it its particular relevance is this sense that it's being deployed to resist further European integration. And that's in 1983. Some things don't change. Williams is not reinforcing then a dominant and exclusionary definition of Englishness. He's actually attacking. Williams reinforces this insight toward the end of the chapter, where he typically relates the preceding discussion to Welsh history and his own Welsh experience. It happens, this is on the handout, it happens that I grew up in an old frontier area, the Welsh border country, where for centuries there was bitter fighting and raiding and repression and discrimination, and where, within 20 miles of where I was born, there were in those turbulent centuries as many as 4 different everyday spoken languages. It is with this history in mind that I believe in the practical formation of social identity. It is now very marked there, and know that necessarily it has to be lived. Not far away, there are the Welsh mining valleys, into which, in the 19th century, there was massive and diverse immigration, but in which, after 2 generations, there were some of the most remarkably solid and mutually loyal communities of which we have record. These are the real grounds of hope.